Hi, folks. I'm your host, Charles Brunn, and this is Go-to-Market Hackers, the show where we go inside the minds of go-to-market engineers and architects, creating the systems that deliver winning outcomes. So maybe before I turn to our awesome guest today, I'll share a little bit about myself. I'm the SaaS founder. I've been leading GTM teams for the past 12 years or so. And what I've always found fascinating is understanding the best practices when it comes to building world-class GTM systems and processes that deliver standout results. And really, this is what this podcast is about. It's about understanding how the best GTM teams are combining the tools and the processes to unlock outstanding growth. And so in that context, I'm not really interested in talking to the CEOs, the CROs, and the VPs. I want to talk to the actual practitioners, the folks that can go deep in the systems and the processes that really separate the leaders from the pack. I want to go into the nitty-gritty details. I want to understand what creates a winning recipe, because typically it's in those nitty-gritty details that you can understand how do you win. So my hope, again, is that listeners can take away practical, actionable insights that they'll be able to apply in their day-to-day jobs in one way or another. So with that said, today's guest is my friend Raj Jain. Raj, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Charles, what's going on?
Good to see you. So Raj is a GTM systems engineer. And I actually met Raj way back when we were both working at Dynamic Yield. This was a personalization startup that had raised quite a lot of money. I think it was a Series D company acquired eventually by MasterCard. And since those early days that we met and that we worked together, Raj has gone on to work at WeWork, MongoDB, Amazon, Taro, and a bunch of other places. And now he's consulting with startups to build their GTM system. So Raj, great to have you on. Maybe you can share a little bit more with the listeners about your background, and then we can talk about interesting, go-to-market systems that you've actually orchestrated on your end.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. It's so wonderful to connect with you after all these years again. And I love what you're doing with GTM hackers. Obviously, we want to make sure that guests get a lot of value. So I think we picked the topics around kind of like AI and CRM and building tech stacks. And I am excited to get into that. Before I do, as Charles mentioned, we worked together at Dynamic Yield, which was a smaller kind of company. And then since then, I've sort of been part of the centralized operations teams at really large enterprises. I think that one thing that's interesting about me, I didn't start off, and I'm sure very few people have the story that's like, oh, when I grow up, I want to be a GTM systems person, right? But like, I actually started off as a salesperson, and then I was interested in all the behind the scenes stuff, and little by little, and probably the same for a lot of our listeners, it's like, knowledge is cumulative and just kind of getting deeper and deeper and evolved into this place where I'm most interested in activating the kind of behavioral and intent signals from our tools to provide the next best action to customers.
I love that you actually started in sales, because that means that you understand the psychology, the problems, the bottlenecks of sales. I think it's like a perfect place to start in order to be able to build the processes that streamline sales and go-to-markets. I think we were going to talk about some of the workflows and architectures that you've put together in various startups that you work. I say startups very loosely because I think Amazon is no longer considered a startup, but it's always day one at Amazon. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about some of the stuff that you built at AWS and also what takeaways from that, because that was, if I'm not mistaken, like pre-LLM days. So would love to hear what you did and maybe how it changes with the advent of LLMs and AI even further.
Yeah, well, AI is so hot right now, and I knew you wanted to get right into the AI topics. But I am glad that you brought up the thing about there's a lot of psychology and stuff because we're going to get into the technical stuff. But I think it's worth noting that kind of like a through line here is that for all the technical stuff, I have to still put on my behavioral psychology and my kind of like human thinking hat on to make sure I'm balancing incentives and meeting people the way that they work because user adoption is so critical to a lot of these things. And there's still so much human in the loop involved with AI that we need to make sure that our stakeholders can find value in what we're doing and that it's easy for, and we're training and enabling them to do the right kinds of things that allow us from a technical standpoint to achieve our goals.
The point about human in the loop is something that's super interesting. There was a stat that said that even like right now, the best workflows, there's still 30 to 40% human in the loop at various steps of the workflow. And that could be you, that's the human in the loop that has to check things or map specific fields, but it could be the sales team, it could be the marketing team, it could be a sales rep, an SDR. I would definitely want to get into that and what it looked like for you at Amazon. And then I think you want to talk about Attio as well.
Yeah, I think the Amazon is a good story about human in the loop because we were using AI at Amazon, but I think in order to make use of that AI, there was a lot of kind of core foundational processes that we were relying on to make sure that we could deploy it in enterprise scale. Because I mean, you talk about some of the stuff that we were doing was like pre-LLMs. Even if LLMs were around, I think when you're at the enterprise level, you really need to be careful about like what kind of AI sort of processes are production ready for like really large workloads. So I can definitely theorize on how Amazon can maybe start to use LLMs for some of the stuff that we were doing. But when I was there, we were solving for a really simple use case, which was managing communication limits for the amount of emails that we're sending. I was part of the central email marketing team at Amazon, and we were gold on database health, like how many people are engaging with our content, how many people are unsubscribing, things like that. And then there was some down funnel metrics related to conversion and revenue, et cetera. But generally speaking, we were interested in like, uh, are customers happy with the kind of messages they're receiving? And from the marketers side, it was like we were a multi-product company. And so the marketers were competing for the same limited pool of people that are relevant for them to send their campaigns to.
Mm-hmm.
And at AWS, we were using Marketo, and Marketo has some communication limits, native features built in, but they're not built for scale or for multi-product companies. I mean, it's more simple limits, like once every X amount of days, I want this person to get one email or two emails and things like
I mean,
that.
it's funny because I feel like Marketo is built for scale, but maybe not the Amazon scale, right? You guys probably had millions of subscribers. And as you said, you probably had dozens of different products within AWS. And so just the sheer volumes is, I don't think anybody can support AWS so seamlessly. I'm assuming you had to do some hair pulling to make it work.
I think we definitely had our challenges, but dare I say, I think the solution was a little bit more simple and elegant from a technical standpoint. But kind of operationally, yeah, so there were certainly challenges. Technologically, all we did was use the API to push data from Marketo into a third party or a first party tool that Amazon built where we could apply some modeling and push that list back. So what that looked like is the challenge was sending it, since we were the multi-product company and people were competing for the same audience, we were trying to figure out, okay, how do we determine if Charles is qualified to receive a campaign on Thursday about five different products, which email should Charles receive? In order to do that, we realized that we liked about Marketo that our marketers could build their segmentation. So I mentioned earlier that a lot of what we did was on the backs of the kind of foundational human in the loop work that we did. And I think that's important to realize that when people are like, oh, we can just plug AI in. But I'll have you understand that we had already trained our marketers to build their segmentation in Marketo to say that, okay, if I want to send an email and the email's in French, make sure that I segment for people that have a French language preference and that, we had a preference center. So like if I have a newsletter type email that I'm sending, segment to people that have a preference of receiving newsletter type emails. So we liked that part of it. Once the marketers used the Marketo's WYSIWYG editor and all their training to build their segmentation, what we did is use the API to pull out that list from Marketo and into this one party tool where we were saying, okay, here's Charles, and these are all the campaigns that Charles is being targeted by. And we know because there's five lists and Charles is on all five of those lists, for example. So in our one party tool, once we can compare how many campaigns Charles is a part of, we can then say, okay, which is the campaign that Charles is most likely to engage with as an email marketing team? We were concerned about engagement in our database, not only opening our emails, but clicking and reading through the emails. So that's how we built our model. We had all these signals from all our different tools that said, okay, this is the kind of products that this person is interested in. This is the actions that they've taken in the product. These are the emails that they've engaged with in the past, etc. And we plugged it in all into a model so that if Charles is set to receive more than one campaign, it will stack rank which one it believes is Charles is most likely to engage with, as
Right.
defined by our KPI. And then we built our own API that pushed that ranked list back into Marketo. So now each of the campaigns had a trimmed down list from what the marketers segmented on. But that list represented the people that were most likely to open in those particular campaigns.
So let me make sure, I'm just going to say it back to make sure I understand. So you basically had kind of like a personalization engine in your preference center where you would rank the preferences across different products, but also maybe different topics. And then you would probably like re-rank or reorder the different sections within that email to make sure that is essentially like you mentioned engagement was the KPI. So to optimize for engagement, right?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't even a reorganized sections and it was determining which email that they received. So there was 5 different emails,
Oh, got it.
right?
So
And we
so
need
they
to
would
figure.
receive, okay, got it.
So we needed to make sure that Charles was only receiving the one winning email. So I mean, yeah, Charles wasn't receiving those other 4 emails, right?
Oh,
But he
got
was
it. So
receiving the
so
one
so
email.
but the one email that was, it wasn't a mix max mash of like those different components. You're like, how do you decide which one of those five? So one email from all, let's say those five products, I would only get one email from one product. Is that,
Correct.
got it? That makes sense.
Now, we had this challenge after because we were basically, as I mentioned, technologically it's kind of simple. Marketers were creating this list of this pool of people, and then we were
Hmm.
cross-checking those lists, and then we were creating new lists of people that were like mutually exclusive, right? That only had one person per
Hmm.
campaign that's supposed to
Hmm.
receive it. Now, and we sent that back. Now the challenge is like marketers were like, oh, I thought I was targeting 100 people, and now my email's only going out to 50 people or whatever. Right. Obviously, I'm talking about scale at Amazon. So it's more
Yeah,
like
that makes
I'm
sense.
targeting 100,000 people and now I'm only whatever. But so then, we had to build intelligence capabilities on top of that that allowed forecasting to happen. So marketers had a reasonable expectation of like, okay, you're building your segmentation in Marketo. Don't start to goal yourself on like, oh, I'm going to convert 2% of 100,000 that I've segmented in Marketo because your real segmentable pool comes back from our prioritized engine. We called it EPS, email prioritization service. So EPS was that 1P thing. So once you fed in we would tell marketers, feed your segmented list into EPS. EPS will
Right.
spit back a new list of the people that
Mm,
are
got
actually
it.
going to get your campaign for the people that are listening. I think like what really want to highlight about this example when I think that could be valuable is that when we started to do this, there was a lot of foundational stuff already built. As you mentioned, we had our preference center, right? And we had our training and enablement for marketers on how to use the tools that are available to them to help so that they can do part of this work. I mean, we weren't building
Right.
the segments, we were just
Right.
prioritizing the segments that were already built.
Right.
And I think another key thing is that at Amazon, we had human in the loop has always been built in. Amazon has these things called bar raiser programs. So Amazon has kind of always recognized the value of having a peer review system that checks it at the highest to the highest standard at the final level before it's production ready. And so as part of our bar raiser for email sends, when marketers build their segmentations, there's a peer that's been trained by our central operations team that's checking their work, right? So if a marketer's saying, "Oh, I have a newsletter type," there's one of their peers that's looking through that email and making sure that it should be categorized as a newsletter.
Got it.
I think that's probably where like in their next iteration, I'm sure Amazon can maybe start using LMs to like read through those emails and making sure some of that QA work is done. But it just goes to show you that there was a kind of a lot of human in the loop happening behind the scenes for us to execute on that one kind of like simple technological use case. And the hardest part of those pieces of that use case was, you know, in training our model, deciding what does engagement, like what does meaningful engagement look like to Amazon? So we need to define what that is. And we had some KPIs as a team, but we really need to look at all the events that we're streaming and say, is this something that we want to rank over another behavior or another event that's coming in?
Can you share any of the impacts on performance and engagement?
Well, we were certainly continuing optimizing and improving, but I will tell you, immediately we noticed an improvement in unsubscribes, right? Like just think about it. Your audience is now, instead of getting 10, 15 emails for 15 different products, they're getting
Right.
one, maybe 2 emails a week of the thing that's the most
That
relevant to
matters.
them. So that was huge. We saw a huge uplift in that. By huge, I mean at least a couple percentage points. I think our unsubscribe was, I mean, we had already had a kind of a historically low unsubscribe because we One of the things that Amazon did is that I wish more companies would do. We regularly made the database inactive if they didn't take a
Mm.
meaningful activity with us. And our inactivity window was like 180 days. For us, it was like if they didn't make any meaningful engagement after 180 days, they weren't going to be sent an email in the next round, right?
Wow.
It was a restriction we placed on ourselves as an email marketing team.
I love that. I don't think that a lot of companies actually do this because you always talk about your list and how many subscribers on your list and you want it to be massive. That's an interesting, I guess, practice that you guys had. Anything else you want to add to that, or should we move on to maybe a smaller startup example? Because again, AWS, you had some restrictions around what you could do, right? You're still only one piece of the whole puzzle versus when you're at a company like Taro, where you have a lot more freedom, I'd imagine, to experiment and do stuff to be able to affect growth.
Yeah, totally. What I learned at Amazon was how to really think about how to deploy an enterprise ready AI capability. At Taro, I kind of got to be more at the cutting edge and not worry so much about if it's production ready because the stakes of the mistakes are lower,
Right.
right? So what I like, at Taro, when I moved to Taro, we were also using AI, and I have a different example. This one is using LLMs because now, I think everybody's like trying to use LLMs, and that's a huge new use case unlock because some of the AWS stuff was kind of possible before. I mean, before you had like data science teams, right, that were combing through these insights and trying to
Right.
find statistical significance around the signals that are going to matter, and then
Right.
training these models. And now we're able to iterate on it faster and find some of these signals using AI itself, right? To
Right.
but I think the listeners want to hear about this Taro one because now it's like it was a more recent and we're using LLMs now, and I think that unlocks a whole new use case because those were the tricky use cases to solve with just training a model because there was so much nuance in language and combing through unstructured data, unformatted data, and trying to find meaning out of all this context. And so that's essentially what I was doing at Taro. And I should mention that Taro is a unique company because we were marketing to Chinese American owners, Chinese American restaurant owners. And as such, a lot of our sales calls were happening in Mandarin. Now, there
Wow.
were Mandarin speaking people at the company, but not as you grow a company, not everybody can speak Mandarin. And certainly there was a number of our sales leaders that couldn't speak Mandarin. When they came to me and they were like, okay, how can we need to be able to understand what's happening on these calls because we need to train our reps and do our forecasting and a whole bunch of other stuff that comes from sales leaders having some fidelity into what's actually happening on sales calls.
Right.
It's kind of pretty important.
Yeah,
So
that's why conversational intelligence tools are now a billion-dollar industry with Gong and all these other tools just exploding.
totally. And I love those tools. And we were actually using Gong and we were pretty happy with it. Gong was giving us the transcriptions of these calls, and the transcriptions were good. But what we found from some of our feedback from our team was that maybe the translations that Gong was
Mm,
offering on these transcriptions wasn't the best. So that's the first thing we wanted to do is we wanted to just test the translation from Gong versus an LLM.
got
So
it.
and I think like what I like about this Taro story is that at the same time that we were using APIs and building data pipelines and pulling out raw data that I'm going to talk about, we were also trying to leverage like the actual features from Gong that are AI native. And I think that's probably the way to go. It's probably a similar story that a lot of people are facing, right? You don't want to reinvent the wheel. If there's something available from a platform and it's working, that's fantastic, especially if it doesn't cost you more
Right.
as part of the
Right.
payment plan. But you may run into these cases where you're like, hey, I wonder, can I test the output of that I'm getting from this native tool against something else? Or maybe I have some specific use case that they haven't built around yet, and I can use the API to kind of build my own case. And so that's a little bit what happened with Taro. So we got this feedback about the translations, and we were like, all right, let's actually use the API. And so we were using Gong and we were using Snowflake. And in Snowflake, you can just put a connector right into Gong and pull out all the data that Gong has
Transcripts. Yeah.
right into Snowflake. Now, failure story. When I first was doing that, I was like, oh yeah, no problem. We'll get the data into Snowflake. But silly me, the data is totally raw and it need to be joined together. I use tools like Airbyte and DBT in conjunction with Snowflake to clean and prepare the data, which involves building staging models and then final marts of joins and renaming fields and
And
columns.
that probably took you like a week or two just to get all the
Totally.
data, clean it. Yeah.
Well, because I'm also not a data engineer, but like I've had to learn this stuff, and that's what like for the GTM hackers out there, like I'm sure you can relate, and a lot of people have this experience. Is like we want to do something, and then there's no real resources to build it, so we kind of have to get our hands dirty, and that's what happened
Right.
with me. I wanted to provide this, and I wanted to make this data usable, and then I needed to kind of prepare the data because there was a lack of resources. So I learned a DBT and there might be some resources and stuff that we can link after the in the show notes for
Definitely.
this episode too for
Absolutely.
the
Yeah,
for
for
the
sure.
listeners. I had to kind of like develop these new skills, and I know our listeners are no strangers to developing new skills. As operators and hackers, we're kind of like used to wearing many hats and learning things and developing new things on the fly. But that's all to say is like once we got the data in there, we were able to compare the translation from the LLM to the translation from Gong, and we found that the one from the LLM was like a little bit better, and we preferred that. Now, the other thing that we wanted to do besides just like the translation and taking a step further is once you have the translation, one of the things that like sales leaders want to try to tend to do in order to sift the data is kind of like tag or categorize the
Smart labels and tracking and all that. Yeah.
totally. And some trackers are easier than others, right? Like if you have a tracker around competitors, it's kind of like a little bit easier because you can just give something a
A
list of your
list. Yeah.
competitors and ask them to read through the transcript. And a lot of those features, to Gong's credit, they're natively out of Gong. It's called the trackers. You can build trackers. You can define trackers in Gong, and it allows you essentially use the UI to do that. Of course, you can also, now that we are sending the transcripts to an LLM, we could also train our LLM to do kind of a similar thing and use the tagging. We found that the Gong trackers work just fine. The other thing which is cool from Gong is they also launched something called smart trackers. And those are like the AI trackers. For the longest time, we couldn't use them at Taro, which is why we were kind of tangentially and simultaneously building our own version by taking the data from the APIs into an LLM. But around the same time we were doing that, all of a sudden, Gong launched multi-language support for their smart trackers, which essentially means now us as a company where calls are happening in Mandarin, the smart trackers
Are picking up
are
in Mandarin.
correct. So what's and what I think is cool is that there's a lot of these kind of tools that are developing these AI features. And the way that the Gong smart trackers work is you're training a model, right? In contrast to the regular trackers, as I mentioned before, we could just give it a list of competitors. But let's say you wanted to tag mentions of pain points. Well, that's not that easy because pain points sound so different, right? There's no list of pain points. Like if they say this, then that's a pain point. It's kind of more contextual, and you need to
Sure.
understand a lot about what's happening. And that's where the LLMs and the smart trackers are great. So that's why we were trying to use the smart tracker to get like to use pain points because we already had trackers around competitor mentions and some of the easier ones, but we wanted to do the pain points one. And so we tested using the Gong, just like we test the Gong translation versus the LLM, we also tested the Gong Smart Tracker feature now against the LLM tracker that we were building around pain points. So in Gong, you can upload kind of the transcripts and point it to the parts of the pain points in the conversation, and it'll learn over
Totally.
time. And that's essentially what you're doing with an LLM. It's just like,
Right.
Gong abstracted it for you. And I think it worked actually pretty well. I gave up spending the time and resources to build the trackers out of the LLM because I'm like, I can just do it easier and faster and more configurable out of Gong as an admin out of the UI. But, I wanted to tell that example. And what I liked about that example is if you're somebody that is trying to do stuff with AI, I don't think you always have to reinvent the wheel. And I think there's a lot of tools that are building AI features that allow you to use low code, no code, UI, WYSIWYG editors to get through your use case. At the same time, I think for people listening to this, you should get comfortable with SQL. I think you should get comfortable using APIs because I think you're eventually going to run into those cases where you said, "Hey, I want to validate this against kind of my own experiments or
Right.
another source or another LM." Or, "Hey, you know, the company couldn't build a product feature around this use case because there's probably not enough people trying to do this, but they made the API available to me and I can just build it myself if I really want this."
So I think like, does it make sense to recommend like kind of like the crawl, rock, run approach where maybe first you use the native capabilities of a tool like Gong. Then obviously if there are gaps and things that you're looking to do, which in this case, it's a pretty big one. If they didn't, translate Mandarin well and you couldn't pick up insights from that, it totally makes sense that you guys started basically building your own pipeline, exporting it to Snowflake, then pushing it to an LLM for translation. And then it sounds like by the time you were done building all that, soon thereafter, Gong actually launched it natively. So, that also tends to happen. And then it sounds like also for the smart tracker, you had the data. So it was easy. Now that it was exported, it was easy to just compare like Gong's native capabilities versus your own homegrown using an LLM. And I think that is cool. That's a reason why being able to work with APIs and understanding how to code in Python or at least read Python can be helpful because it allows you to also test out the different workflows and processes and see what works better for your unique situation. I mean, again, you can start with what's there, as you said, no need to reinvent the wheel. But there are edge cases that, every company has. And at some point, it makes sense to kind of explore those venues as well.
And because of the way existing legacy tools are launching AI features or even new tools are coming on the market, I think the GTM stack is changing, right? Like I
Totally.
love tools like Clay. I hear so many people using N.
Right.
I think obviously I still use Salesforce. I think a lot of people are using Salesforce, but I don't know. I think maybe like the nature of the way that we are thinking about CRM tools and even activating our data using data warehouses and CDPs, the interplay of all these tools is kind of changing. I'm actually curious to what you think about that or how you see the changing nature of the technology stack.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely changing a lot. And I think we were talking about this before this call about like what is even like the future, like what does the tool stack look like when you're building out a GTM team and the GTM motions? Obviously, I believe the CRM is still at the heart of all this, but then the definition of a CRM varies, right? If you're saying, hey, a CRM is just a data warehouse where you're putting all your data, then to your point, you could have it in Snowflake and you don't need to have it in Salesforce, right? I've been working with a bunch of startups at various levels. The old school one needs something that's more stable and that nobody's going to get fired for using. But the new ones are really experimenting a lot, right? They're using Airtable and they're using Notion as their CRM, or they're using literally a Snowflake or something like that. And they're connecting it to a whole bunch of other tools. You can be so much more nimble. You can spend a lot less money and have a lot of workflows that are automated with AI agents using tools like N8N or Make, which I've been using a lot too. So I think, yeah, it's changing a lot. I can tell you that the teams that are innovating the most on the GTM side are the teams that are using these newer, more lightweight tools. But let's be honest, these are not tools that can support an Amazon. You're going to have tools that can break and where the systems don't scale to certain levels. And so you have to be comfortable with that. This happens to me a lot. Like, I'm building workflows, something crashes, something's not working. I reach out to support, it's literally non existent. These are tools that are just not there yet. They're not ready for some of these more advanced use cases. But there's so many things to do, man. So many things to do. If I were Salesforce, I would certainly be concerned. I've also been playing with a tool CRM called Attio, which I think is UK based, which is super cool. AI native CRM. You can build out the workflows automatically. Basically, all the workflows you can build natively in Attio is what you would hire an expensive Salesforce admin to do, right? And you can do it in a day, do all of the automations you need versus it would take, I don't know, 3 weeks to have a Salesforce admin set everything up and put the proper guardrails, et cetera. So again, it's about speed of execution, easiness, and simplicity. I think, yes, there are aspects of it that are pretty technical. Like N8N, I've been playing with, and it is complex. Like I am struggling to get end to end complex workflows to work because things aren't mapping proper. And I'm like debugging for hours trying to make them work. Not easy, but a lot of exciting tools coming out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of seeing similar stuff. Like, as far as the people that are still using the legacy tools, I think you're totally right. And what I'm seeing is people picking apart specific use cases off those legacy tools. I mean, like we talked about the one with at Amazon with EPS. It's like, okay, well, like, there's this communication limits that in itself is like could be a whole product
Right.
that somebody could build, especially when you get to those enterprise kind of like use cases. And that's essentially what we did. Is we productized this one part of Marketo and bypassed the native sending capability to inject our own list of people before the send was hit, right? And we kind
Right.
of like disabled the ability for people to send until, the new list was and kind of put those guardrails up. And I'm seeing people do similar stuff to Salesforce too, especially with some of those conversation intelligence tools like that we talked about. Certainly, one of the use cases of Force is that we're trying to represent what happened, let's say during the sales cycle into fields in the CRM so we can understand and track and measure. Well, now with conversation intelligence, you can pull all that stuff directly from the call of what the prospect said. Some of the stuff that was lost in translation or missed, we can take some of that work off of the plate of the sales person.
Right.
Certainly the stuff that takes their, kind of perspective and nuance to digest and create an insight around, we want to retain the ability for salespeople to provide that insight using Salesforce. But there's a lot of stuff on the call that we can get directly from the call intelligence and saving salespeople the time of having to input that manually or trying to synthesize what was said by the client and then select the correct pick list value that corresponds to you
Right.
know, so I think that's kind of like the way the nature of the CRM and stuff is changing. And certainly with stuff like the data warehouse, I don't think you need to have Salesforce. I think we try to force Salesforce as a source of truth, but I think Salesforce's true value is it's a piece of the GTM, right? The sales piece of the GTM. We don't need to force all of the data we have about everything into Salesforce. We can keep it in a data warehouse, in a CDP, and so in a mix of tools that allow us to activate the data without having to keep it in sync or have it copied over, because that opens you up to GDPR and data access and right to be forgotten. Now you need to forget the data across all these tools. Well, wouldn't it be nice if you had zero copy data that you can preview from these tools and activate in the tools, but is managed centrally so that it's easier to operationalize and
I mean,
keep in compliance?
to, that's the dream. Also, it means that you can basically essentially change and swap out tools as you wish, right? Which is also everybody's dream, like not having to be chained to a specific tool. Salesforce would certainly disagree. Like they do see themselves, to your point, as the central point of truth or source of truth, the brain of the GTM. The CRM is the brain of the GTM. I mean, even when you look at Agentforce, like Agentforce is set up in a way that when you're building out these agent workflows within Agentforce, you're pulling from, like, it's basically pulling from all the context that it has in the CRM, all the data points, et cetera. And it actually makes it pretty cool because it understands some of the parts because it has access to that data. Now, you could argue that, yeah, well, it could have access to that data through, zero copy data, et cetera. That's true, but that's not how Salesforce is orchestrated currently, and they certainly don't want you to be able to pack your bags and try and move somewhere else if you wanted. What you're saying is that Salesforce, when you say it's like more of a sales tool, it's the tool that the sales team is inside to be able to look at their notes, add context, etc., and then that would be pushed to some other place. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I just think we try to stuff so much, and I'm talking about specifically about Salesforce Sales Cloud because that's the
Right.
thing that most people
Sure.
know. I mean,
Sure.
obviously, Salesforce has been trying to get people to put their DS data in Service Cloud and this stuff but I think like for a lot of companies, they can relate to being like, okay, we have Sales Cloud. How do we get like everything that we can into Sales Cloud, right? Like even
Of course.
service data and churn data and this data and so even if people are like, oh, Salesforce is dying. I don't know if Salesforce is dying. I think it's going back to like being at least used for what it should be used for because we were just stuffing so much stuff into it to try to max it. And a little bit to your point, because we were bound to that ecosystem, right? Like if you wanted to do something, it's like, oh, it had to be in Salesforce. Well, now
Right.
we have APIs and stuff where we can, people are democratizing that data. And that's why, like, I think like one of the things I want the readers to get away from or the listeners to get away from this is that readers too for anyone that's reading the transcript but is that look, using AI and yeah, there's cool use cases like building agents and I think that's on the horizon, but like practically in your day to day, I think it's gonna be more about kind of like the simple use cases that you want to get right that are can be deployed at the enterprise level, which already still require a lot of human in the loop, let alone some of the more complex use cases that will require more human in the loop and stuff. So I would say like, when you're using AI, focus on the simple use cases and make sure that you have a lot of the other, don't overlook the other infrastructure that's needs to be there to take advantage of the AI to make it actually work and production ready. I'm bullish on how these AI features are being abstracted and made available natively in different kind of tools for people to use. And I think a lot of them are great. I think, however, that for the real hackers out there, the people that want to set themselves apart from the pack, you want to get comfortable using SQL and working with APIs because that'll allow you to test the outputs of the native features that you're getting or build your own tools. Product companies, they'll only build the native features that have mass market appeal and mass use cases. And not all of your use cases are going to fit into that bucket. And it's just not economical for them to develop that feature. But they did make the API available to you, and there's no reason why you can't develop the feature. So, that's what's going to set you really apart. That would be my advice for people that are hacking and building out there. Keep hacking, keep building. Don't reinvent the wheel, but also make sure that you have the tools under your belt to really get it done when nobody else can.
Exactly. Great insights. Raj, I know that you're working with a bunch of startups, consulting as a GTM systems engineer. Where can people find you? Is it on LinkedIn?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn B2B Raj is my handle.
Awesome.
And after spending some time at these large enterprises, I'm helping smaller, mid-sized companies find their groove, leveraging the latest AI trends and some of the enterprise frameworks that I've learned that tried and tested enterprise frameworks as well, and kind of bringing those together into something that could be a competitive advantage for these mid-sized companies where they're doing stuff on the cutting edge, but making sure that they have the foundational pieces in place to really capitalize on those opportunities that they create from their GTM.
Raj, this has been a really insightful conversation. Really loved the examples you gave, the wisdom you shared. So thanks for imparting this with the audience. Really great to see you. I'm excited to hear more about the next workflows you'll be building. Maybe we'll have you on another time to talk about the latest cool workflows you're working on. But in the meantime, thanks for joining GTM Hackers. Really great to have you on, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Charles.